The scorching sun hung low over the battlefield, casting long shadows on the blood-soaked earth. The Crusader knights, clad in their heavy steel armor, stood bewildered, their banners torn, their spirits crushed. Before them stood a man whose name would echo through history, not just as a warrior, but as a symbol of justice, mercy, and unyielding faith. Salahuddin Ayubi, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had once again defied the odds, standing tall as the defender of Islam and the liberator of Jerusalem. But who was this man beyond the battlefield? Was he just another warlord in an era of endless conflicts, or was he something greater, a force of destiny, shaping history not only through the sword but through his wisdom and character? To his enemies, he was a formidable foe, a relentless tactician who shattered the might of European knights at Haddon. To his own people, he was a beacon of hope, a leader who sought not only conquest but unity among the fractured Muslim lands. Even his greatest rivals, men like Richard the Lionheart, spoke of him with admiration, a rare acknowledgement of respect between adversaries sworn to destroy one another. Salahuddin was not born into royalty, nor did he inherit power through bloodline or privilege. He was a man forged by struggle, a warrior raised in the shadow of greater men before him, learning the art of leadership not through birthright but through sheer determination. He did not rise to prominence with a lust for power but with a vision to reclaim what had been lost, to restore honor to a land that had been desecrated by invaders, and to unify a people divided by their own greed and conflicts. His story is not merely one of war and conquests, it is the story of a man who reshaped an era, who stood against the tides of history and changed its course. It is the story of a ruler who, even in victory, showed kindness to his enemies, refusing to mirror the cruelty that had stained the Crusades. It is the story of a leader whose actions were guided not by arrogance but by an unwavering sense of duty. The legacy of Salahuddin Ayubi stretches far beyond the walls of Jerusalem. It lingers in the pages of history, in the hearts of those who seek justice, and in the echoes of a past where a single man stood against an empire and won, not just through battles but through his unwavering principles. This is the tale of Salahuddin, the legend, the warrior, the statesman, and the man who turned the tide of history. In the ancient city of Tikrit, on a cold winter night in 1137, a child was born into a family of Kurdish origin, a family destined to shape history. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayub, was a respected commander serving under the Seljuks, and his uncle, Shirkuh, was a warrior of great renown. This child, named Yusuf ibn Ayub, would later be known to the world as Salahuddin, the man who would defy empires and reclaim Jerusalem. But before he became the legend, he was simply a boy navigating the turbulent world of the 12th century, where power was fleeting, and survival depended on strength, loyalty, and wit. His early years were spent in Baalbek and Damascus, cities brimming with scholars, warriors, and political intrigue. Unlike many rulers of his time, Salahuddin was not raised in luxury but in the disciplined environment of a soldier's household. He was taught the ways of the sword, the art of command, and the wisdom of governance, yet he was equally drawn to the world of knowledge, studying Quranic sciences, poetry, and philosophy. Despite his upbringing in a military household, young Salahuddin was not initially inclined toward war. He was deeply intellectual, more interested in scholarly pursuits than the chaos of battle. It was his uncle, Shirkuh, a fierce and ambitious general, who would pull him into the whirlwind of power struggles that defined the age. The stage was set in Egypt, where the decaying Fatimid Caliphate had become a battleground between rival factions. The Sunni Seljuks of Syria, under the command of the mighty Nur ad-Din Zangi, sought to bring Egypt under their control to counter the growing influence of the Crusaders and the Shia Fatimids. Shirkuh, recognizing an opportunity for his family, led multiple campaigns into Egypt, and with him, he took his young nephew, Salahuddin. At first, Salahuddin was merely an observer, standing in the shadows of greater men. But war has a way of forging its own path, and soon he found himself at the heart of Egypt's political turmoil. In 1169, after years of bloody conflict, Shirkuh emerged victorious, seizing control of Egypt. His triumph, however, was short-lived. He died just months later, leaving behind a power vacuum. To the surprise of many, it was not a seasoned commander who succeeded him, but Salahuddin himself. At only 31 years old, Salahuddin was suddenly the most powerful man in Egypt. His appointment was met with skepticism. He had not yet led great battles, nor did he possess the intimidating presence of his uncle. The Fatimid court was filled with enemies waiting for him to fail, and in Syria, Nur ad-Din watched closely, uncertain if his young general would remain loyal. But Salahuddin was no ordinary ruler. He moved swiftly, consolidating his power with a blend of diplomacy, intelligence, and, when necessary, ruthless efficiency. He dismantled the crumbling Fatimid regime, restoring Egypt to Sunni rule and ensuring its allegiance to the Abbasid Caliphate. Yet, his greatest challenge was not just ruling Egypt, it was surviving in a world where alliances shifted like desert sands. He navigated court conspiracies, thwarted assassination attempts, and strengthened his position until he was no longer just the governor of Egypt, but its true sovereign. Over time, his name became synonymous with leadership, and his vision extended beyond the Nile. He saw the divisions among Muslim rulers and the looming threat of the Crusaders. He knew that as long as the Muslim world remained fractured, the Crusaders would continue to exploit its weakness. By the time Nur ad-Din passed away in 1174, Salahuddin was no longer just a rising commander, he was a force to be reckoned with. He marched into Syria, not as a conqueror, but as a unifier, bringing Aleppo, Mosul, and Damascus under his banner. His rise was no longer in question, he was now the undisputed leader of the Muslim world. And with power finally in his hands, he turned his gaze toward his true destiny, Jerusalem. Salahuddin had emerged from the shadows of his predecessors, no longer just a general but a ruler shaping the destiny of the Muslim world. Yet, power in those times was fragile, and leadership was not granted, it was seized, defended, and solidified through unyielding determination. The Muslim world was deeply fractured, torn apart by internal rivalries between Sunni and Shia factions, power-hungry emirs, and a lack of unity in the face of the Crusaders. Salahuddin knew that as long as these divisions persisted, Jerusalem and the lands of Islam would remain vulnerable. His next great challenge was not on the battlefield, but in the courts of rulers who saw him as a threat rather than a savior. With Nur ad-Din Zangi's death in 1174, Salahuddin found himself at a crossroads. His former master had been a formidable leader, but his sudden demise left Syria in disarray. Nur ad-Din's young son, al-Salah, was named his successor, but he was too inexperienced to hold the empire together. Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul, instead of rallying under one banner, fell into a state of chaos, with rival factions vying for control. Salahuddin, now ruler of Egypt, saw the impending danger. If Syria remained divided, the Crusaders would exploit its weakness. The only way forward was unification. Salahuddin set out from Cairo with a calculated plan. His first move was Damascus, the heart of Syria and a city of immense strategic and spiritual importance. Unlike his predecessors who often resorted to brute force, Salahuddin took Damascus without shedding blood. The people of the city welcomed him as a liberator, for they had grown weary of weak leadership and internal strife. His reputation as a just and pious leader had spread far and wide, and many preferred his rule over the uncertainty of local feuding warlords. But while Damascus fell into his hands with ease, Aleppo and Mosul stood as fortresses of resistance. The emirs ruling these cities saw Salahuddin not as a unifier but as an outsider attempting to seize their power. For years, he waged a delicate campaign, not just of warfare but of diplomacy. He forged alliances through marriage, negotiated with tribal leaders, and presented himself not as a conqueror, but as the rightful leader of a united Muslim front against the Crusaders. However, when words failed, Salahuddin did not hesitate to unsheathe his sword. His battles in Syria were not just against Muslim rulers who opposed him but also against the ever-looming threat of the Crusaders. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, despite suffering from leprosy, was a cunning and formidable adversary. The Crusaders were aware that if Salahuddin succeeded in unifying the Muslim world, their hold over the Holy Land would be in jeopardy. They launched raids on his territories, attempting to weaken him before he could gather full strength. Salahuddin, in turn, struck back with swift and decisive attacks, ensuring that while he fought internal battles, he did not lose sight of the greater war ahead. One by one, his enemies fell. In 1183, after years of political maneuvering and military campaigns, Aleppo finally accepted his rule. The last major opposition, Mosul, submitted a few years later. By 1186, Salahuddin stood as the undisputed ruler of a unified Muslim empire, stretching from Egypt to Syria, encompassing vast lands that had once been torn apart by rivalries. He had achieved what many before him had failed to do. He had united the fractured Muslim world under a single banner. With unity achieved, Salahuddin turned his full attention to the ultimate goal, the liberation of Jerusalem. The Crusaders had ruled over the sacred city for nearly a century, and the call for its liberation echoed in the hearts of Muslims everywhere. But Salahuddin knew that taking Jerusalem would require more than just military strength. He needed an army that was not just well equipped but also driven by faith, a force that would march not for conquest, but for justice. The road to leadership had been long and arduous, but Salahuddin had walked it with unwavering resolve. Now, with the Muslim world standing behind him, he was ready to embark on the greatest campaign of his life, the reconquest of Jerusalem. The stage was set for one of history's most defining conflicts. Salahuddin had spent years uniting the Muslim world, and now, with a powerful army under his command, he turned his gaze toward the Crusaders. For nearly a century, Jerusalem had remained under Christian rule, ever since the First Crusade had left it drenched in Muslim blood. It was no longer just a city, it had become a symbol of both conquest and resistance, a prize fought over by empires and faiths. Salahuddin understood that reclaiming Jerusalem was more than a military objective, it was a duty. But the Crusaders were no ordinary foes. Led by King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, known as the Leper King, they were well aware of Salahuddin's growing power and were determined to defend their territories. The Crusader states, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Antioch, and Tripoli, stood like fortresses in the Levant, bolstered by knights from Europe who viewed themselves as warriors of God. Among them was Raynald de Châtillon, a ruthless and ambitious warlord whose actions would soon ignite a war that neither side could avoid. For years, Salahuddin had exercised patience, offering peace where war seemed inevitable. But Raynald, blinded by greed and hatred, repeatedly shattered those efforts. He raided Muslim caravans, looted trade routes, and even threatened the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. To Salahuddin, this was more than a provocation, it was blasphemy. When Raynald attacked yet another Muslim caravan, slaughtering men and enslaving women and children, the Sultan's patience ran out. War was no longer a choice, it was an obligation. Salahuddin launched a campaign that shook the foundations of Crusader rule in the region. His forces struck with precision, targeting Crusader fortresses and supply lines. He did not act recklessly, knowing that Jerusalem itself could not be taken without first weakening the enemy's ability to resist. The turning point came in 1187, when both armies prepared for the battle that would decide the fate of the Holy Land, the Battle of Hattin. On the morning of July 4, 1187, under the blazing sun of the Galilean hills, Salahuddin's forces surrounded the Crusader army near the village of Hattin. The Crusaders, led by King Guy of Jerusalem, had made a fatal mistake. Lured away from their water sources and exhausted under the relentless heat, they were trapped. Salahuddin's men set fire to the dry grass, choking the enemy with smoke, while his archers rained arrows down upon them. The Crusaders, weakened and desperate, were slaughtered. By the end of the battle, the once mighty Crusader army lay in ruins. King Guy was captured, and Raynald de Châtillon was brought before Salahuddin himself. The Sultan, known for his mercy, offered Guy water, a symbolic gesture of life. But when Raynald reached for the cup, Salahuddin pulled it away. "I do not offer drink to a traitor," he declared before executing Raynald with his own sword. The message was clear, mercy had its limits. With the Crusader forces shattered, Salahuddin advanced toward Jerusalem. Unlike the first Crusaders, who had butchered every inhabitant when they took the city, Salahuddin vowed that there would be no bloodbath. On October 2, 1187, after a short but intense siege, the city surrendered. The banners of Islam once again flew over Al-Aqsa Mosque, and instead of a massacre, Salahuddin granted safe passage to the Christian inhabitants. Churches were left untouched, prisoners were ransomed rather than slain, and even the defeated nobles were treated with dignity. His chivalry stunned Europe, earning him admiration even from his enemies. But victory did not end the war. News of Jerusalem's fall sent shockwaves through Europe, leading to the Third Crusade. Kings from the West, Richard, the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, gathered massive armies to reclaim the city. The conflict between Salahuddin and Richard would become legendary, a battle not just of swords but of wits, endurance, and mutual respect. Salahuddin had achieved what seemed impossible, he had turned the tide of history. But the war was not over, and the struggle for the Holy Land had only just begun. The sun rose over the parched lands of Galilee, casting its golden light over a landscape that would soon be stained with blood. The year was 1187, and the fate of the Holy Land hung in the balance. Salahuddin had spent years preparing for this moment, uniting the Muslim forces, studying his enemies, and waiting for the perfect time to strike. Now, that moment had arrived. The Crusaders had marched into his trap, and the greatest battle of his life was about to begin. For nearly a century, the Crusader states had ruled over Jerusalem and its surrounding territories. Their armies, bolstered by knights from across Europe, had built formidable fortresses, commanded powerful warhorses, and wielded the latest in medieval warfare. But they had never faced an opponent like Salahuddin. The Sultan was not merely a warrior, he was a master strategist, one who fought with both his sword and his mind. And as he stood atop a hill, overlooking the Crusader army, he knew he had already won, before the first arrow was even fired. The Crusaders, led by King Guy of Jerusalem, had been drawn into the worst possible position. Deceived by Salahuddin's tactics, they had abandoned their fortified positions in Tiberias and marched straight into the desert, believing they could force a decisive battle. But Salahuddin had planned this meticulously. His men had burned the fields ahead of the Crusaders, cutting off their access to food. He had poisoned the wells, depriving them of water. And now, as they struggled through the blistering heat, exhaustion and desperation had already begun to set in. The night before the battle, Salahuddin's forces did not rest. Instead, they harassed the Crusader camp relentlessly, riding close, shouting war cries, firing arrows into the darkness. The Crusaders, thirsty and exhausted, found no sleep. By dawn, they were weak, their morale already shattered before the fight had even begun. Then came the final blow. Salahuddin's men set fire to the dry grass surrounding the Crusader army, choking them with thick smoke. The air was filled with the cries of men and the whinnying of terrified horses as the flames spread. Archers rained down arrows from the hills, cutting down soldiers who could barely lift their shields. The once mighty Crusader army, which had terrorized Muslim lands for decades, was now a cornered beast, trapped, wounded, and waiting for the kill. Salahuddin gave the order, and his forces descended upon the Crusaders. The battle was brutal but one-sided. Knights in heavy armor collapsed from heat exhaustion before they could even lift their swords. Muslim cavalry, swift and relentless, slashed through their ranks. The Crusaders fought bravely, but bravery could not save them. The enemy was too many, their strength too depleted. One by one, they fell. King Guy of Jerusalem and his commanders tried to rally their troops, but panic had already spread. Some soldiers attempted to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Salahuddin's men surrounded them from all sides. Others fell to their knees, begging for their lives, but Salahuddin had already made up his mind. He would show no mercy to those who had defiled the lands of Islam. As the sun reached its peak, the Crusader army collapsed. Thousands lay dead, their bodies scattered across the battlefield like broken relics of a lost cause. The survivors, including King Guy and the infamous Reynald de Chatillon, were taken captive. Salahuddin, ever the tactician, knew the power of symbolism. He had captured the true cross, the most sacred relic of the Crusaders, which had been carried into battle in hopes of divine protection. It was now his prize, paraded through the streets of Damascus as a testament to the Muslim victory. But there was one more act to play. Reynald de Chatillon, the man who had repeatedly broken truces, raided Muslim caravans, and threatened the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, was brought before Salahuddin. The Sultan, known for his mercy, offered water to King Guy, as a sign that his life would be spared. But when Reynald reached for the cup, Salahuddin pulled it away. "I do not give drink to traitors," he said. And with one swift stroke, he executed Reynald himself, a final punishment for the years of bloodshed he had caused. The Battle of Hattin was not just a military victory, it was the turning point of the Crusades. The Crusader states, once powerful and arrogant, were now leaderless and broken. And as Salahuddin turned his eyes toward Jerusalem, he knew that the time had come to reclaim the Holy Land. With Hattin, he had shattered the Crusaders' grip on the region. Now, only one great battle remained, the battle for Jerusalem itself. The gates of Jerusalem stood tall, weathered by time and war. Behind them lay the city that had changed hands more than once, soaked in the blood of those who fought to claim it. But as the sun cast its golden light over its domes and spires in October 1187, something different was about to happen. Unlike the brutality of the Crusaders who had massacred its people when they took the city nearly a century before, this conquest would be marked not by slaughter, but by mercy. Salahuddin, the Sultan who had shattered the Crusaders at Hattin, now stood at the threshold of his greatest victory. Jerusalem had been in Crusader hands since 1099, when the First Crusade ended in a horrifying massacre. Men, women, and children, Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians, had been put to the sword without mercy. Now, nearly 90 years later, the Muslim world had united under Salahuddin's banner, and the city's fate was once again in his hands. But he was not a man of vengeance, he was a man of justice. After his crushing victory at Hattin, the Crusader states were in disarray. Their armies had been decimated, their leaders taken captive. The road to Jerusalem lay open, and Salahuddin wasted no time. As his forces advanced, one Crusader stronghold after another surrendered, unable to resist the might of his armies. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, and other key cities fell swiftly. The Crusaders who survived Hattin had fled to Jerusalem, desperate to make a final stand. Inside the city, chaos reigned. The civilian population, many of them refugees who had escaped the earlier battles, feared the worst. They knew what had happened when the Crusaders took the city decades before. They expected the same bloodbath. But Salahuddin was not like those who had come before. Balian of Ibelin, the commander left to defend Jerusalem, knew his situation was hopeless. His forces were outnumbered, their morale shattered. Yet he refused to surrender without a fight. As Salahuddin's army encircled the city, siege engines were raised, and arrows darkened the sky. The walls trembled under relentless assault, but the Crusaders inside fought desperately, knowing that if the city fell, the Crusader kingdom would be lost forever. Days turned to weeks as Salahuddin tightened his grip. His forces broke through key fortifications, breaching the outer defenses. The end was near, and Balian knew it. With no reinforcements coming, he requested negotiations. He feared a massacre, but Salahuddin surprised him. Unlike the Crusaders who had painted the streets red with Muslim blood when they took the city, Salahuddin offered peace. The terms of surrender were generous. There would be no mass executions, no forced conversions. Instead, the Crusaders would be allowed to leave if they paid a ransom. Those who could not pay would not be killed or enslaved. Instead, Salahuddin, moved by mercy, personally paid the ransoms for many of the poor, setting them free. Even the Christian holy sites, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, were left untouched and protected under Muslim rule. On October 2, 1187, Jerusalem opened its gates to Salahuddin. His army entered, not as conquerors bent on destruction, but as liberators restoring justice. Unlike the Crusaders who had desecrated the Al-Aqsa Mosque upon their arrival decades before, Salahuddin ordered its immediate purification. The Golden Dome that had been used as a Christian church was restored as a place of Muslim worship, and the call to prayer echoed once again through the city. The Crusaders and their families marched out, carrying what little they could, their heads bowed in defeat. But there was no massacre, no revenge. Even Queen Sabila, the wife of the captured King Guy, was allowed to leave unharmed. Christian pilgrims were still permitted to visit their holy sites, and the city remained a place of worship for all faiths. The news of Jerusalem's fall sent shockwaves across Europe. Pope Urban III is said to have died from shock upon hearing that the city was lost. Kings and nobles across Christendom called for a new crusade, the Third Crusade, to reclaim what Salahuddin had taken. But for now, the holy city was back in Muslim hands, under the rule of a man whose chivalry and sense of justice would be remembered for centuries. Salahuddin had done what many before him had failed to do, not just reclaim Jerusalem, but prove that war did not have to mean senseless bloodshed. His victory was not just on the battlefield but in the hearts of those who witnessed his mercy. The Crusaders had taken the city in blood, but he had reclaimed it with dignity. And in doing so, he cemented his legacy not just as a warrior, but as a ruler of unparalleled honor. The fall of Jerusalem to Salahuddin in 1187 sent shockwaves through Europe. The loss of the Holy City, which had been under Crusader rule for nearly a century, was seen as an unbearable humiliation. From the courts of England to the Vatican, the call for vengeance echoed, and soon, the most powerful rulers of the Christian world gathered their forces for what would become the Third Crusade, a campaign that would bring Salahuddin face to face with the legendary King Richard the Lionheart. The Crusaders' first major success came at Acre in 1191. The city had fallen to Salahuddin's forces after Jerusalem, but now, after a brutal 2-year siege led by King Richard, Philip II of France, and the remnants of the Crusader army, it returned to Christian hands. Salahuddin fought relentlessly to lift the siege, launching counterattacks and harassing the Crusaders' supply lines, but the enemy's numbers and naval reinforcements overwhelmed the defenders. The loss of Acre was a severe blow, but Salahuddin did not despair. He knew that holding Jerusalem mattered more than any single battle. After securing Acre, Richard the Lionheart marched south towards Jaffa, aiming for Jerusalem. Salahuddin, understanding the importance of slowing the Crusader advance, adopted scorched earth tactics, ensuring that Richard's forces found no food, water, or shelter. He ordered wells to be poisoned, crops to be burned, and villages to be emptied. This relentless strategy forced Richard's army to struggle through harsh conditions. Yet, the Crusaders pressed on, determined to reclaim what they had lost. One of the most intense battles between the two titans of war occurred at Arsuf on September 7, 1191. Richard had been leading his army along the coast when Salahuddin's forces ambushed them in the forests. The battle was fierce, with Salahuddin's cavalry launching relentless hit-and-run attacks, hoping to weaken the Crusader ranks. However, Richard, a brilliant military strategist in his own right, maintained discipline among his knights and waited for the perfect moment to counterattack. When the signal was given, the heavily armored Crusaders charged, shattering Salahuddin's lines. It was a rare defeat for the great Muslim commander, but it did not break him. Jerusalem still remained in his hands. Despite his victory at Arsuf, Richard knew that capturing Jerusalem would not be easy. Salahuddin's fortifications were formidable, and the Sultan had amassed a powerful defense inside the city. Richard's army, suffering from exhaustion and dwindling supplies, advanced twice toward Jerusalem but failed to launch an assault, realizing that they could not hold the city even if they took it. The harsh desert climate and Salahuddin's constant raids ensured that a prolonged occupation would be impossible. What followed was a series of negotiations between the two legendary warriors. Richard knew that another full-scale war would be costly and uncertain, while Salahuddin understood that despite his victories, the Crusaders would never cease their attempts to reclaim the Holy Land. In 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa was signed. The agreement allowed Christians to freely visit Jerusalem as unarmed pilgrims, while the city itself remained under Muslim control. Coastal territories such as Jaffa and Acre stayed with the Crusaders, ensuring a continued Christian presence in the region. Though Richard was unable to achieve his ultimate goal, his military prowess had earned him Salahuddin's respect. After the treaty, Richard left for England, ending the Third Crusade. Salahuddin, however, had little time to celebrate. His years of warfare had drained his health, and his kingdom faced new challenges. The endless battles, the political struggles within the Muslim world, and the weight of maintaining an empire had taken their toll. By early 1193, Salahuddin fell seriously ill in Damascus. His body, once so strong and unyielding on the battlefield, had weakened. Despite his illness, he continued to manage the affairs of his empire until his final moments. On March 4, 1193, Salahuddin, the great warrior who had humbled kings, who had reclaimed Jerusalem with honor, and who had become a legend in both the East and the West, passed away at the age of 55. His death left the Muslim world in mourning. The man who had dedicated his life to the service of Islam, who had shown both mercy and might, had left behind an empire, a legacy, and a memory that would endure for centuries. Even Richard the Lionheart, upon hearing of Salahuddin's passing, is said to have mourned the loss of such a worthy adversary. Though Salahuddin's body was laid to rest, his story did not end with his death. The Muslim world he had helped unify soon fell into political strife once more, but his example remained. He had shown that a leader could be both a warrior and a man of justice. He had proven that faith and strategy could triumph over division and oppression. And above all, He had taught the world that victory was not just about conquest, but about honor, compassion, and wisdom. The name Salahuddin Ayubi is not just a symbol of military triumph but of a leader whose character embodied the very ideals of honor, justice, and compassion. Unlike many conquerors whose legacies are built on bloodshed and tyranny, Salahuddin's greatness was defined by his balance of power and mercy, his commitment to faith, and his deep sense of justice. From the way he governed his people to how he treated his enemies, his legacy endures as a beacon of what true leadership should be. One of the most striking aspects of Salahuddin's character was his remarkable humility and simplicity. Despite ruling a vast empire stretching from Egypt to Syria, he lived modestly. He shunned extravagance, preferring a simple lifestyle even when he had access to immense wealth. Unlike many rulers of his time, he did not hoard treasures or build grand palaces for himself. When he passed away in 1193, it was said that there was barely enough money left for his burial. Every coin he had was spent on his army, the poor, and the cause of Islam. His compassion and generosity extended beyond his own people. One of the most famous examples of this came during the Third Crusade when King Richard the Lionheart fell ill. Salahuddin, instead of using the moment to his advantage, sent his personal physician and fresh fruits to the Crusader king. This act of chivalry astonished even his enemies, reinforcing his reputation as a noble adversary. Even after the bitter battles of the Crusades, many Crusader knights and chroniclers described him with admiration, acknowledging that he was a man of principle who upheld the values of honor and respect in warfare. Yet, Salahuddin was not just a man of mercy, he was also a brilliant strategist and warrior. His understanding of military tactics was unparalleled, and his ability to adapt to changing battle conditions made him a formidable opponent. His strategy was not one of reckless aggression but of careful planning and patience. He knew when to strike and when to retreat, how to weaken his enemies before engaging in decisive battles, and how to use diplomacy to secure long-term victories. His conquest of Jerusalem in 1187 was not just a military triumph but a masterclass in leadership, proving that calculated strategy and unwavering faith could achieve the impossible. Perhaps what truly set Salahuddin apart from other rulers was his extraordinary sense of justice. He believed that leadership was a responsibility, not a privilege. Unlike many rulers of his era who sought revenge upon victory, Salahuddin showed mercy to those he conquered. When he reclaimed Jerusalem, there was no mass slaughter, no forced conversions, and no destruction of Christian holy sites. This stood in stark contrast to the First Crusade nearly a century earlier when Crusaders had massacred tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews upon capturing the city. Salahuddin's actions were not just a political move but a reflection of his deep commitment to Islamic teachings, which emphasized justice and mercy even in victory. His governance was marked by fairness. He worked tirelessly to ensure that his people, regardless of status, were treated with justice. His court was open to petitions from the common people, and he personally intervened in cases where he saw injustice. He was known to walk through the streets in disguise to observe the conditions of his people, ensuring that those in power did not exploit their positions. Unlike many rulers who surrounded themselves with flatterers, Salahuddin welcomed honest advisors and was willing to accept criticism if it meant better governance. Beyond war and governance, Salahuddin was also a patron of education and religious scholarship. He funded the establishment of madrasas, Islamic schools, and promoted the study of Islamic sciences. He understood that the strength of a civilization was not just in its armies but in its knowledge and spirituality. His support for scholars and theologians ensured that Islamic teachings continued to flourish, and his efforts in preserving Islamic culture left a lasting impact on the Muslim world. But for all his achievements, Salahuddin remained a deeply human figure. He was known to break down in tears when he saw the suffering of his people. Despite his strength on the battlefield, he carried the burdens of leadership with great emotional weight. When his men would prepare for war, he would spend nights in prayer, seeking guidance and asking for Allah's help in ensuring justice. His victories were never seen as personal glory but as a responsibility to protect Islam and its people. Even in death, Salahuddin's humility was evident. He left behind no riches, no grand tomb built in his honor. His only wealth was the love of his people and the admiration of his adversaries. When he passed away, his attendants had to borrow money to afford his funeral, a testament to how he had lived his life, spending everything for the cause of Islam and his people. His grave in Damascus remains a site of reverence, visited by those who still seek inspiration from his legacy. Salahuddin Ayubi's life is a rare example of a ruler who wielded immense power yet remained guided by morality, faith, and justice. His story is not just one of battles and conquests but of leadership rooted in principles. He proved that a leader could be both a warrior and a man of mercy, both a conqueror and a peacemaker. His legacy is not just in the lands he ruled but in the ideals he upheld, ideals that continue to inspire millions today. As the sun set on one of history's greatest warriors, Salahuddin Ayubi found himself in a battle unlike any he had ever fought, one he could not win. After decades of relentless campaigns, strategic brilliance, and unwavering devotion to his people, his health began to decline. The man who had once marched tirelessly across battlefields, liberating cities and uniting the Muslim world, now struggled to rise from his bed. His body, once filled with the strength of a warrior, had given in to the weight of time and exhaustion. The years of ceaseless war had taken a toll on Salahuddin. Despite his victories, he had never ruled from a place of luxury or excess. He spent his wealth on his soldiers, the poor, and the well-being of the Ummah. Even as his empire flourished, he lived humbly, never indulging in the riches that so many rulers before and after him sought. By the time he fell ill in late 1192, his physicians recognized that his body was failing, yet his spirit remained strong. Even in his weakened state, he continued to concern himself with the affairs of the state, ensuring that justice prevailed and that his people were cared for. As the illness tightened its grip, Salahuddin's attendants and family gathered around him. The once feared warrior, who had led thousands into battle and stood against the might of the Crusaders, now lay helpless. Despite the pain, he remained steadfast in prayer, whispering verses from the Quran, his lips moving in quiet devotion to the Lord he had served so faithfully. He refused to let despair take hold, embracing his final days with the same dignity that had defined his life. Even his enemies, particularly King Richard the Lionheart, acknowledged his greatness. Upon hearing of Salahuddin's illness, Richard expressed genuine sorrow, for he knew he was losing not just an adversary but a worthy opponent, a man who had redefined the meaning of honor in war. Salahuddin had not only defeated the Crusaders on the battlefield but had won their respect through his mercy and sense of justice. As news of his impending death spread, the people of Damascus and beyond mourned. Salahuddin had not just been their ruler, he had been their protector, their inspiration. He was not a king who ruled from the shadows of a palace. He had walked among his people, fought for their safety, and devoted his life to their cause. For many, the thought of a world without him was unimaginable. On March 4, 1193, at the age of 55, Salahuddin Ayubi took his final breath in Damascus. The city that had witnessed his rise to power now bore witness to his passing. His attendants and family wept, but his legacy was too great to be defined by sorrow alone. His death was not just the loss of a leader but the departure of a man who had shaped the course of history. What followed was perhaps the most telling testament to his character. When the time came to arrange his burial, his treasurers discovered that Salahuddin had left behind almost nothing. Despite ruling an empire that spanned vast territories, he had not hoarded wealth for himself. He had spent everything in the service of Islam and his people. There was not even enough money left to afford a proper burial, and his attendants had to borrow funds to lay him to rest. His final resting place in Damascus remains a site of reverence. Unlike the grand mausoleums of many rulers, Salahuddin's tomb is simple, reflecting the humility with which he lived. Pilgrims and leaders from across the world have visited his grave, paying respects to a man whose name became synonymous with justice, courage, and faith. In death, as in life, Salahuddin Ayubi stood apart. He did not seek power for personal gain, nor did he let arrogance corrupt him. His victories were never about glory but about duty. He fought not for conquest but for justice, not for wealth but for faith. His legacy is not written in gold but in the hearts of those who still remember him as the noble warrior, the merciful leader, and the unwavering servant of Allah. Centuries have passed since the era of Salahuddin Ayubi, yet his name continues to echo in the annals of history. Unlike many conquerors whose legacies were built on bloodshed and tyranny, Salahuddin's was forged in honor, humility, and unwavering faith. He was more than just a warrior. He was a leader, a unifier, and a man of profound integrity whose actions still inspire millions today. His story is not merely one of battles and victories but of justice, mercy, and resilience in the face of immense challenges. The defining feature of Salahuddin's legacy is not just his military genius but his character. In an age where kings and rulers sought personal glory, he sought the unity of the Muslim world. At a time when war was often fought without restraint, he displayed compassion even to his greatest enemies. His treatment of prisoners, his refusal to engage in unnecessary cruelty, and his ability to win respect from both his allies and adversaries set him apart from other rulers of his time. The fact that even his fiercest opponents, such as King Richard the Lionheart, spoke of him with admiration speaks volumes about the kind of man he was. But Salahuddin's true greatness lay in the balance he struck between being a warrior and a statesman. His governance was not built on fear but on justice. He did not rule from the shadows of a golden throne, he walked among his people, ensuring their welfare. His reforms strengthened the economy, stabilized the regions under his rule, and provided security to both Muslims and non-Muslims alike. He understood that true power did not lie in conquest alone but in maintaining peace and prosperity for his subjects. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of Salahuddin's life was his humility. Despite commanding vast armies and ruling over extensive territories, he never let arrogance take root in his heart. When he passed away, he left behind almost nothing in personal wealth. His riches had been spent in the service of his people and his faith. Unlike many rulers who amassed fortunes for themselves, Salahuddin understood that true wealth lay in the legacy one leaves behind, not in the gold one hoards. His impact on the Muslim world cannot be overstated. His victory at Hattin and the recapture of Jerusalem were not just military triumphs, they were moments that restored hope and dignity to the Muslim Ummah. Yet, even in victory, he did not seek vengeance. When he entered Jerusalem, he ensured that no blood was spilled, that no churches were desecrated, and that civilians were treated with mercy. It was a stark contrast to how the Crusaders had behaved when they first took the city nearly a century before. Salahuddin's story is not just one for history books, it is a lesson in leadership, perseverance, and faith. He teaches us that true power is not measured by the number of battles won but by the impact one leaves on the world. He reminds us that righteousness and strength are not mutually exclusive, that one can be both a warrior and a man of peace, both a ruler and a servant of the people. Today, his name stands as a symbol of resistance against oppression, a beacon of hope for those who struggle, and an inspiration for leaders who seek to rule with justice. His tomb in Damascus remains a site of reverence, visited by those who wish to pay tribute to a man who redefined what it meant to be a leader. Salahuddin Ayubi did not just reclaim a city, he reclaimed the spirit of a people. His legacy lives on, not in the castles he conquered, but in the ideals he embodied. He remains, for many, the greatest example of what a true Muslim leader should be, brave yet merciful, strong yet humble, victorious yet just. His story is not just one of the past, it is a guiding light for the present and the future.